By the time the defendant realized the room was no longer amused by her attitude, it was already too late. What had started as one more smug little performance in a television courtroom was turning into something far more dangerous for her. A slow public unraveling. She had walked in with the posture of someone who believed she was smarter than everybody else in the room. She had that polished kind of confidence that looked expensive from a distance and reckless up close. And the moment she lifted her chin, gave a little laugh under her breath, and acted as if the woman sitting behind the bench was just another person she could talk over, the temperature in the courtroom changed. The case sounded simple when it was first announced. A young event photographer from Phoenix was suing her former client for unpaid damages, emergency replacement costs, and intentional destruction of business property after a wedding day meltdown spiraled into a full-blown disaster. But within the first few minutes, it became obvious that this was not really about a camera bag, a broken lens, or even a missing payment. This was about control. It was about humiliation. It was about one woman who had spent her entire adult life mistaking charm for immunity, finally colliding with the kind of intelligence that did not bend for attitude. The plaintiff, Elena Cruz, looked exhausted in the way only deeply wronged people do. Not loud, not theatrical, just tired down to the bone. She sat upright, hands folded too tightly in her lap, wearing the expression of someone who had replayed the same day in her head 100 times and still couldn't believe another adult had behaved the way this woman had behaved. She was 29, professional, organized, and visibly nervous, but there was something steady about her. She had brought folders, printed emails, screenshots, timeline notes. She looked like the kind of person who had spent years building a business carefully, one referral at a time, and who now found herself in court, not because she enjoyed conflict, but because the only other option was swallowing a loss she could not afford. Then there was the defendant. Savannah Blake did not look nervous. She looked inconvenienced. She was 32, immaculately dressed, with salon hair that didn't move, a cream blazer over a fitted dress, and the kind of expression that suggested she had spent the morning practicing innocence in a mirror. But the real tell was in the details. The tiny eye roll when the plaintiff's name was read, the bored half smile, the way she leaned back before anyone had even asked her a question, like she was settling into a show she expected to win. There was already a kind of performance radiating off her, a polished, fake politeness confidence that read less as calm and more as contempt. She kept touching her hair, crossing and uncrossing her legs, glancing toward the audience as if she were worried about being seen from the wrong angle rather than worried about the facts. And behind the bench sat the judge figure everyone in that room knew better than to underestimate. She did not look angry. That was what made her dangerous. She looked observant, still, interested. She had the posture of someone who had seen every version of arrogance available to the human species and was never in a hurry to interrupt a fool in the early stages of self-destruction. Her face remained composed as she glanced between the parties, reviewed the filing, and let the silence sit a second longer than comfortable. People often misunderstood that silence. They thought it meant softness. It never did. It meant she was measuring. The dispute began 6 months before the courtroom hearing when Savannah hired Elena to photograph a luxury wedding weekend in Scottsdale. According to the contract, Elena was booked for a rehearsal dinner, 8 hours of wedding day coverage, and an edited gallery delivery within 4 weeks. The total package was $4,800. Savannah paid the deposit, signed the agreement, approved the shot list, and according to Elena, became increasingly difficult in the days leading up to the event. There were late-night text messages, sudden timeline changes, demands for extra locations not included in the package, requests for same-day previews before the event had even ended. But Elena, trying to protect the client relationship and the referral network attached to high-end weddings, kept things professional. The wedding day itself was where everything shattered. According to Elena, the ceremony ran late, the reception schedule fell apart, and by the time family photos were supposed to begin, Savannah was already furious over problems that had nothing to do with photography. The florist had made a mistake. The seating chart had triggered an argument. A bridesmaid had gone missing for nearly 40 minutes. The cake arrived with a damaged tier. Instead of directing her anger where it belonged, Savannah started redirecting it toward the one vendor who could not disappear, the photographer. Elena claimed Savannah barked orders, demanded retakes in impossible lighting, blamed her for guests wandering off, and repeatedly insisted on shots that required time the schedule no longer had. Then, near the dance floor entrance, with staff, family, and guests nearby, Savannah grabbed Elena's secondary camera bag, accused her of ruining the entire visual memory of the day, and threw the bag down hard enough to crack a professional lens and damage a flash unit. Savannah's version was very different. In Savannah's telling, she had been the victim of an incompetent photographer who froze under pressure, failed to capture essential moments, and then tried to weaponize a small accident for profit. She described the bag drop as a harmless gesture taken in frustration after Elena kept making excuses. She insisted nothing was thrown in a violent way, said the equipment was probably already damaged, and repeatedly referred to the lawsuit as a revenge filing from a vendor who knows she did a bad job. Her whole defense relied on the belief that if she sounded sufficiently offended, the facts might rearrange themselves in her favor. That belief started cracking almost immediately. The judge asked Elena to describe the contract terms. Elena did so clearly. Deposit amount, balance due date, coverage limits, overtime fee structure, damage liability clause, conduct expectations, gallery timeline. Every answer had the tone of someone who knew her own paperwork because she had written it, used it, and depended on it. She did not exaggerate. She did not dramatize. She simply laid out what had happened. Then Savannah was asked whether she had signed the contract. She gave the first smile. "Well, I electronically acknowledged it, yes," she said, with the careful, slippery wording of someone trying to create daylight where none existed. The judge looked up. "That means you signed it." "I clicked it," Savannah replied. "That means you signed it." Savannah gave a short laugh, as if the distinction mattered, and the room was somehow expected to appreciate her cleverness. It did not. It just hung there, sour and foolish. The audience could feel the first warning sign of arrogance coming off her in waves. She was not simply defending herself. She was trying to dominate the logic of the room by acting above it. The judge moved on. Elena presented invoices showing the unpaid final balance, receipts for emergency equipment repair, and a written statement from the rental house she had been forced to use the following morning because the damaged gear had made her unable to complete another booked event with her normal kit. That mattered. It turned the case from a he said, she said emotional dispute into a measurable financial chain reaction. The broken lens was not just a broken object, it was interrupted income, replacement cost, business disruption, consequential damage. Savannah's posture shifted only slightly. She still looked confident, too confident. Then came the first escalation. The judge asked Savannah a simple question. If the photographer had truly done such a terrible job all day, why had Savannah continued using her through the entire reception rather than removing her or instructing the planner to intervene? Savannah shrugged. Because unlike some people, I was trying not to make a scene. There was a tiny pause after that answer, the kind that tells you everyone in the room knows something ridiculous has just been said. The judge leaned forward. "You're telling me you were trying not to make a scene on the same day you admit you grabbed her bag?" "I moved it." "You didn't move it. You already called it a drop." "It slipped." "Out of your hand?" "Yes." "While you were angry?" "I was emotional. It was my wedding." The judge's voice remained flat. Being emotional is not a legal defense for breaking other people's property. Savannah smiled again. "That's your opinion." That was the first moment the audience stopped seeing her as merely difficult and began seeing her as reckless. It was not just the words. It was the delivery, the little tilt of the chin, the dismissive softness in her voice, like she was correcting a service worker. It crossed an invisible line. You could almost feel the oxygen tighten in the room. Elena stared forward, stunned that anyone would say something that foolish out loud in court. And the judge, still calm, made the kind of note that never bodes well for the person being written about. Savannah had made the first major mistake rude people always make in places built on consequences. She mistook composure for weakness. The second escalation arrived through text messages. Elena handed up screenshots from the night of the wedding and the morning after. In them, Savannah sent a stream of messages that started furious and got worse. There were accusations, insults, threats of bad reviews, demands for immediate delivery of edited images, and most importantly, one line that changed the complexion of the entire case. In response to Elena asking Savannah to reimburse the broken gear, Savannah had written, "Maybe next time don't stand there like an idiot when a bride is upset. Consider the lens part of your lesson." The courtroom went still. That was not the language of a harmless accident. That was the language of someone who believed punishment was her right. Savannah tried to recover instantly. She sat forward and said the messages were taken out of emotional context. But the more she spoke, the worse it got. She claimed sarcasm, then hyperbole, then autocorrect, then said she didn't remember the exact exchange. The problem with lying in layers is that the layers never line up cleanly. Every attempt to soften the message only emphasized that it existed and that she had sent it. The judge asked, "Did you write that?" Savannah answered, "I wrote something like that." The judge repeated, "Did you write that?" Savannah exhaled, "Yes, but no. Stop it, yes." The rhythm of the room changed again. That should have been enough damage for one hearing, but Savannah still believed she could talk her way around the facts if she stayed aggressive. So she pushed harder. She interrupted Elena twice. She tried to answer questions before they were finished. She muttered under her breath. At one point, while Elena was describing the condition of the damaged equipment, Savannah let out an audible, theatrical sigh and said, "Oh my God, is she going to cry over a camera forever?" It was a stupid sentence. A needlessly cruel sentence, and she delivered it with such open contempt that it detonated across the room. That was the unforgettable disrespect moment, not because it was loud, but because it revealed everything. It showed that Savannah did not feel regret. She felt annoyance that another human being still expected accountability. She was not embarrassed by what she had done. She was irritated that it continued to cost her attention. Even the audience reacted. There was a visible ripple of discomfort among the people watching. Elena's face tightened, but she did not speak. She didn't need to. The sentence had already injured Savannah more than it hurt her. The judge turned slowly toward the defendant, and when she spoke, the air left the room. "You are not going to sneer at someone whose property you damaged and whose livelihood you interfered with. This is not a cocktail lounge. This is not your reception. And this is not the part of your life where you get to throw something, insult the victim, and then sit here acting bored because the consequences arrived on schedule." Savannah tried to jump in. "I didn't." The judge cut her off cleanly. "No, you have mistaken polish for credibility. That was your first problem. Your second problem is that the documents don't agree with you. Your third problem is that your own mouth keeps making this case worse." The audience was silent now, completely locked in. Some people crumble when they are yelled at. Savannah was not one of those people. She crumbled when she was read accurately. You could see it in her face. The confidence didn't vanish all at once. It began to fracture around the edges. The half-smile stopped returning naturally. Her blinking increased. Her shoulders lost that loose, draped confidence and became rigid. She started gripping her own wrist as if holding herself together physically. That is what exposure does to certain personalities. It doesn't merely embarrass them. It interrupts the illusion they depend on. Then came the evidence reveal that truly cornered her. Elena produced a statement from the wedding planner who had not appeared in person but had submitted a signed declaration along with venue incident notes. In those notes, the planner described hearing Savannah shout, "If you can't do your job, I'll make sure you pay for this day one way or another," moments before the camera bag hit the ground. The planner also documented that a venue coordinator had immediately approached because the impact was loud enough to draw attention near the ballroom entrance. Savannah said the planner was biased. Then Elena produced a short, silent security clip from the venue hallway camera. It did not capture the entire argument head-on, but it captured enough. Savannah could be seen stepping toward Elena, taking hold of the bag, jerking it away, and throwing it downward with angry force. There was no delicate slip, no accidental drop, no harmless relocation. The movement was sharp, deliberate, and performed with the body language of someone trying to punish. The bag bounced. A staff member visibly flinched. Savannah's face changed in real time as the clip ended. It was the first honest expression she had worn all day. Not honesty in words, honesty in panic. She looked at the screen, then at the judge, then briefly toward the audience before catching herself. And in that tiny sequence, everything collapsed. The bluff was gone. The room had just watched the difference between a curated story and an actual event. The lie was no longer theoretical. It had shape, movement, physics. The judge asked quietly, "Do you still want to describe that as a slip?" Savannah swallowed. It was not as bad as it looks. That answer was fatal, because guilty people under pressure often choose the worst possible compromise. They stop fully denying, but they still refuse full responsibility. They cling to distortion. They scale down. They minimize. They try to negotiate with reality after it has already entered the room. The judge's response was devastating in its precision. That statement tells me more than the video, because an innocent person seeing that would say, "I was wrong." A responsible person would say, "I lost my temper. You're still trying to convince me I didn't see what I just saw. That is why I don't trust a word you say." Elena didn't smile. She didn't need victory on her face. The truth was finally doing the work for her. The case could have ended there and still been satisfying, but the moral reversal deepened when the financial logic came together. Savannah had insisted throughout the hearing that Elena was exaggerating the loss because wedding vendors love fake emergency fees. That line aged badly once the receipts were reviewed. The damaged lens was a high-end professional lens, not a consumer accessory. The flash unit was visibly cracked in the submitted photo taken immediately after the incident. The rental invoice matched the date of Elena's next event. The repair estimate aligned with the manufacturer's service center. The unpaid balance was clearly still owed because Savannah had halted payment on the final installment after the wedding. Suddenly, the case was not just about bad behavior. It was about a pattern. Use, blame, punish, withhold money, then insult the person left holding the damage. The judge asked one final series of questions, and they were the kind of questions that separate performative confidence from actual coherence. If the photography was so terrible, why are you demanding the edited gallery? Because I paid a deposit. You also stopped the final payment because I was dissatisfied. Then why do your messages demand expedited edits instead of a refund? Savannah hesitated. Because I needed the images. Needed them because it was my wedding. And who took those images? Savannah said nothing. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The person you are now mocking in court is the same person whose work you were demanding at midnight. That tells me you knew perfectly well she did the job. What you resented was that the day wasn't obedient to your fantasy, so you found someone safe to bully. That landed harder than shouting ever could have. Savannah's eyes watered then, not from remorse exactly, but from the unbearable pressure of no longer controlling the narrative. Her breathing changed. Her voice lost its polished edge. She began answering in shorter fragments. That's not fair. You don't understand the stress. You weren't there. All of it weak. All of it too late. Because the courtroom had moved beyond her preferred story and into the structure of what had actually happened, and the emotional center of the case became clearer. Elena was not just suing over an object. She was fighting against a specific type of person, one who believes that money, image, or social confidence creates a private exception to basic decency. One who thinks other people's labor exists to absorb their tantrums. One who assumes that if the victim is less powerful, less polished, or less connected, the damage will simply disappear into silence. That silence had not happened here. The judge reviewed the numbers one final time. Unpaid contract balance, lens damage, flash damage, rental cost for emergency replacement, filing fee. She reduced one minor requested amount for a padded accessory the plaintiff had not sufficiently documented, which only made the ruling stronger because it showed fairness rather than emotional siding. Then she delivered the judgment with the kind of clean finality that makes a courtroom feel like a moral mechanism rather than just a legal room. On the plaintiff's claim, I find that the defendant intentionally mishandled business equipment during an angry confrontation, then attempted to minimize the conduct, withhold final payment, and discredit the plaintiff rather than accept responsibility. The evidence is clear. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $6,170. There it was. No flourish, no chaos, just consequence, stated plainly. Savannah looked like she had been pushed out of her own body. Her lips parted, but nothing came out for a second. Then she whispered, "That's insane." The judge answered immediately, "No, what's insane is treating another person's livelihood like a prop in your bad mood." Elena finally exhaled, and it was the kind of exhale people make when they have been carrying something heavy for too long and are just now realizing they can put it down. She did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She simply nodded once, eyes bright with the private relief of being believed, but the ending still had one last image left in it. As the parties gathered their things, Savannah's whole performance had evaporated. The elegant posture was gone. The chin was no longer high. She wasn't glamorous now. She was just a woman in expensive clothes standing in the wreckage of her own behavior. The room had seen the arc in full. The smug entrance, the dismissal, the mockery, the lie, the evidence, the fracture, the ruling. Everything she had counted on at the start of the hearing, image, attitude, social confidence, practiced indignation, had become useless the moment logic pinned it to the table. And that is why cases like this linger, not because the money was enormous, not because the argument was the loudest, but because everyone watching recognized the deeper truth at its center. Some people spend years confusing being difficult with being untouchable. They think cruelty looks like strength if they wear it with enough polish. They think a sneer can outrun facts. They think the people they damage will stay small. Then one day they meet a room where none of that works. A room where receipts matter more than status. A room where video matters more than charm. A room where contempt is not power. And a room where, for one long, unforgettable afternoon, entitlement finally had to answer for itself. By the time Savannah walked out, the case was over, the numbers were entered, and the illusion she arrived with was gone. All that remained was the final image, a calm plaintiff clutching her folder, a silent defendant staring ahead, and the unmistakable sense that one woman had come to court expecting to manage the optics of a disagreement and instead found herself exposed by the facts she thought she could talk over. That was the real judgment, not just that she had to pay, but that for once everyone saw her clearly.